Imagine that awful feeling in your stomach when your old mother phones you, sobbing. Now imagine getting that phone call when you're at a big meeting for city leaders, and you discover that the mean homeowners association leader just knocked down the house you grew up in to build a place to park cars. What they didn't realize was that they messed with the wrong person, a powerful city leader. I had the ability to make their lives miserable. But how much revenge is too much, even when you control the whole city? Have you ever felt that awful, helpless feeling when someone you care about is being picked on? That's how I felt, seeing my 78-year-old mother, Margaret, shaking, holding another HOA warning in her hands, which were wrinkled with age. But let me go back to the start. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I first saw Karen Whitfield, the new HOA president, walking around Margaret's front yard with a measuring tape and a phone. I was bringing Margaret her food for the week, which I did every Sunday since my father died 3 years before. Margaret's house wasn't fancy, but it felt like home. It was a 2-story house made of brick where I had spent my childhood, with my father's homemade wind chimes still making music in the wind, and Margaret's beautiful roses making the air smell wonderful. "Excuse me," Karen's sharp voice broke the quiet morning. "These roses are exactly 3.2 inches taller than the rules allow." She held the ruler up in Margaret's face, almost like she was threatening her. "And these things," she said, looking down her nose at my father's wind chimes, "they're not allowed." I was about to speak, but Margaret held my arm. "It's okay, dear," she said quietly. "Don't cause problems. Remember your job as deputy mayor." That's how my mother was, always putting others first. Even now, with this woman almost yelling at her, she was concerned about my job. If I had known what was going to happen, I wouldn't have just nodded and driven off to my next meeting with city officials. The warnings started coming every day after that. First it was the roses, then the wind chimes. Soon, Margaret was getting in trouble for everything. From having the wrong color mailbox to having too many birds at her bird feeders. Each warning had a fee, and each fee was higher than the one before. I tried to talk to Karen at the HOA meeting they held each month. "These rules weren't there when my mother's house was built," I explained, trying to stay calm, even though I was furious. "She's been living here for 40 years. Karen just gave a fake smile, moving her expensive glasses. "Rules are rules, Deputy Mayor Johnson," she said. The way she said my job title showed she was challenging me to use my power. But what really hurt was finding Margaret crying one evening, trying to get my father's ceramic angels out of her garden. "Karen says they're not allowed," she said, crying softly. Her hands were shaking so much that she almost dropped one. "She's threatening to take the house if I don't follow the rules." I helped Margaret inside and made her some tea. My mind was working fast. This wasn't just about garden decorations. I'd seen that look in Karen's eyes, like a predator, the way she kept talking about how much houses were worth and keeping the neighborhood looking good. Something else was going on. That night, as I was leaving, I saw an expensive car parked nearby. Through the dark windows, I could see Karen talking to someone. I saw a logo on the car door. Golden Parking Company. My phone beeped with a message from Lisa Brown, an old friend from high school who was now on the city council. "Check your email," it said. "You need to see this." I looked at my phone and opened the file. It was a plan for a new neighborhood improvement project. My heart sank when I read where it would be. Just then, Margaret called from her porch. "Don't forget your lunch, dear." She was smiling, surrounded by her roses, standing in the exact spot marked on the plan's map. As I drove home, questions filled my head. Why was Karen really measuring the property? What was she planning with Golden Parking Company? And most importantly, how far would she go? I held the steering wheel tightly, a plan starting to form in my mind. Karen might think she was in charge, But she'd forgotten one important thing. I hadn't spent 5 years as deputy mayor without learning how to fight back. The real question was, could I reveal her plan before it was too late? I'll never forget the morning I saw Karen in front of Margaret's house, taking pictures with her phone and talking. My stomach sank when I heard her say, "Yes, this is the property. It's perfect for the new project." She jumped when she saw me, quickly ending the call and putting on her fake smile. That evening, I sat at Margaret's kitchen table, holding a cup of her tea, watching her hands shake as she showed me the stack of HOA warnings, 37 in just 2 weeks. "They're even complaining about the bird feeder your father made," she said, her voice cracking. The wooden feeder had been in our backyard for 25 years, attracting birds to brighten Margaret's mornings since my father died. I decided to go to the next HOA meeting, not as the deputy mayor, but as a worried daughter. The community center was full, but when I entered, it became quiet. Karen sat at the front table, tapping her perfectly done nails on her computer. "Deputy Mayor Johnson," she said, making my title sound like an insult. "How nice of you to come." The meeting started as usual, with talks about pool hours and fence colors. Then Lisa Brown, my friend and a city council member, gave me a note. "Check item 7 on the list." When Karen got to it, I felt a chill. It was a proposal for community improvement project partnership with Golden Parking Company. Karen showed a presentation with plans for a much-needed parking area to help the growing community. The location? A group of underperforming properties that included Margaret's house. The pictures showed a shiny parking structure where our family homes now stood, with shops and increased profits. I raised my hand, staying calm even though I was furious. "Miss Whitfield, have the homeowners been asked about this?" The room became tense. Karen's smile stayed as she replied, "The HOA board can make decisions for the good of the community. Your mother's old-fashioned property is, unfortunately, lowering neighborhood values." After the meeting, Lisa pulled me aside. "There's more," she said quietly, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "I've seen Karen meeting with people from Golden Parking Company 3 times this month. They're not just planning a parking lot, they're talking about a whole shopping center." That night I couldn't sleep. I got my laptop and started looking through city records, property maps, and HOA rules. Something wasn't right. The HOA area had clear borders, and Margaret's property was right on the edge. I needed to know more, but Karen had already blocked my official requests for HOA documents, saying it was a conflict of interest because of my job as deputy mayor. The next morning, I paid a detective to look into Golden Parking Company. While waiting for answers, I visited Margaret, only to find her crying again. Karen had sent 2 inspectors who spent an hour taking pictures of everything in Margaret's house, saying they were recording violations. The rose bushes my father planted for their 40th anniversary had been marked with orange tape, meaning they had to be removed immediately. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. Through Margaret's kitchen window, I could see Karen in her backyard, having what looked like a big argument with a man in a suit. I took a picture with my phone, zooming in. The man turned and I almost dropped my phone. It was Robert Whitfield, Karen's husband. But why was he meeting with her in their backyard instead of at the HOA office? The answer came the next day when my detective called. "Deputy Mayor Johnson," he said, "you need to see this. Golden Parking Company is part of Whitfield Development Corporation. Karen's husband is the boss?" I sat back, everything falling into place. The constant bothering of Margaret, the quick proposals, the blocked documents. It wasn't just about property values or parking. It was about money, power, and doing wrong. And Karen had no idea she'd just given me everything I needed to stop her. As I walked to my car that evening, Karen called out, "Deputy Mayor Johnson, I hope you're not going to make this personal. Business is business, after all." I turned slowly, looking at her. "You're right, Karen. Business is business. and you have no idea who you're dealing with." My heart stopped when I saw 15 missed calls from Margaret. I was in a boring conference room in Washington, D.C., listening to another mayor talk about parking meters, when my phone started ringing again. This time I answered. "Honey, there are big yellow machines outside," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "They're destroying my garden, my roses. They're crushing everything." I grabbed my laptop and ran out of the meeting, not caring about the looks. "Margaret, stay inside. I'm calling the police now." But the sounds coming through the phone made me furious. The crash of wood breaking, Margaret's scared scream, the sound of heavy machines getting closer. "They say I have 10 minutes to get out," Margaret cried. "Karen's here with some men in suits. They're saying something about problems with the house and emergency orders. They won't listen to me." I called Karen, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried the HOA office. No answer. I even called our family lawyer. But it was Sunday. Every minute felt like forever as I heard more destruction through the phone. "The police are here," Margaret whispered. "But Karen's showing them some papers. They're just standing there, watching. Please, I don't know what to do." I felt helpless, trapped far away. "Get your medicine and photo albums now, Margaret, and Dad's flag from the war. Don't argue, just do it." My friend Lisa finally answered her phone. She lived near Margaret. "I'm already here," she said, her voice angry. "It's bad, really bad. They have 3 bulldozers and a crew to tear down the house. Karen's drinking on her porch like she's watching a show. Your mom needs to get out now. They're not stopping." I heard glass breaking. Margaret was crying harder now. "The photos. There are too many. Lisa's trying to help, but they won't give us more time." "Leave them," I said, hating every word. "Just get out, please, Margaret. Get out now." The next few minutes were a rush of phone calls, to the governor's office, to every news station, to my emergency team, but it was like pushing against a wall. By the time I got through to anyone with power, it was too late. I watched it happen on Lisa's phone, live. The house where I grew up, where my father taught me to ride a bike, where Margaret baked cookies every Sunday, turned into pieces and dust in under an hour. Karen stood there the whole time, that mean smile on her face, as she watched my mother crying in Lisa's arms. When my plane landed 6 hours later, I drove straight to Lisa's house, where Margaret was staying. She looked so small, holding my father's folded flag and her medicine bag, the only things she managed to save. The ceramic angels, her recipe books, their wedding album. Everything else was gone. "I tried to stop them," she whispered, her hands shaking as she held mine. "I kept telling them you're the deputy mayor, but Karen just laughed. She said not in this neighborhood she isn't." I held Margaret while she cried herself to sleep that night, but my mind was racing. Karen thought she'd won, that she'd finally broken us. She had no idea what she'd just started. Tomorrow I'd show her what being deputy mayor really meant. But first, I needed to make some calls. As Margaret finally fell asleep, I noticed something in her pocket. A crumpled warning from the HOA. But this one was different. The date was wrong, and Karen's signature looked strange. I took pictures with my phone. Maybe Karen wasn't as careful with her paperwork as she thought. And maybe, just maybe, this was the clue that would reveal her whole plan. Sitting there in the dark, watching Margaret sleep, I made a promise. Not just to rebuild our house, but to make sure Karen and her HOA would never hurt another family again. They thought they'd seen the last of us, but this was just the start. I couldn't sleep that night. Watching Margaret cry herself to sleep on my couch, holding the only family photo she saved, the image of Karen while Margaret's home was destroyed kept playing in my head. At 3 a.m., I'd decided I'd had enough. My hands shook as I looked up the city's property records on my laptop. Something about that demolition felt wrong. Even HOAs couldn't move that fast without the right paperwork. Lisa had taught me to trust my feelings during my first year as deputy mayor. And right now, My feelings were screaming that Karen had messed up. I called Lisa, not caring about the time. "I need to see the old property maps," I said when she answered, sounding sleepy. "The ones from before the HOA existed." 20 minutes later, she was at my door with her laptop and a determined look. We spread everything out on my kitchen table, while Margaret slept nearby. "Look at this," Lisa whispered, pointing to a faded line on an old map. "The original property line puts your mom's front yard outside the HOA's area by exactly 3.5 feet. My heart started racing. "And where did they start tearing down the house?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Lisa showed the photos I'd taken earlier. "Right at the front steps." But that wasn't all. As we looked deeper into the permit records, something even bigger appeared. Golden Parking Company wasn't just any company. It was owned by Thomas Whitfield, Karen's husband. The same company that had been given a special contract for the demolition and parking lot construction worth millions. My phone buzzed. A text from Mark Reynolds, my old college friend who now worked at the local news. "Check your email," it read. "You need to see this." I opened the video he'd sent, and there it was. Security footage from last week, showing Karen and her husband meeting with the demolition company behind the community center, exchanging what looked like envelopes. The sun was rising when we finished figuring everything out. Karen hadn't just knocked down my mother's home. She'd planned a whole scheme. The violation notices, the emergency demolition order, the parking contract. It was all part of a plan to get rich. She had been careless in her greed, leaving a trail of evidence even a new lawyer could follow. I made Margaret her favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with extra syrup, and told her to trust me. Then I called an emergency meeting with the city's legal team. They were shocked, but excited. This was the kind of case that could change things. By noon, we had a clear plan. That afternoon, I walked into the HOA office, calm as could be, asking to see their demolition permits. Karen's helper stammered something about them being in process. I smiled, remembering my father's old advice: keep your friends close and your evidence closer. Just then, Karen walked in, that familiar smirk on her face. "Deputy Mayor Johnson, what a surprise. Coming to accept progress?" she asked, pointing to the mess visible through her office window. I watched her face carefully as I placed a single photo on her desk. The security footage screenshot of her parking lot deal. Her smirk disappeared quickly. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, reaching for the photo. I pulled it back, adding more to the pile. Property maps, permit violations, contract documents. "You know, Karen," I said, "my dad always said the best revenge is justice with a bit of karma." The color drained from her face as she realized what I'd found. But when she reached for her phone to call her husband, I was already heading for the door. "Oh, and Karen," I turned back, "the HOA meeting tonight is going to be very interesting. You might want to bring your lawyer." As I walked to my car, I could hear her frantically dialing, but it was too late. The evidence was already safely filed with the prosecutor, and copies were on their way to every HOA board member's email. Margaret's roses might be gone, but justice was about to bloom. I looked at my watch. 6 hours until the HOA meeting, 6 hours until Karen learned what happens when you knock down the wrong deputy mayor's mother's house. And this time I'd make sure every neighbor was there to watch her world fall apart, just like she'd watched Margaret's home fall. I walked into City Hall that morning with a heavy briefcase and an even heavier heart. The emergency meeting I called wasn't just about Margaret's house anymore. It was about every family that Karen and her HOA friends had bullied. My hands were shaking, but my voice wouldn't be. The council room was packed. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like warnings. Karen sat in the front row, wearing her expensive suit and that fake smile she always used when she thought she was winning. She even had the nerve to wave at me. "Last week," I began, Many of you watched as bulldozers destroyed my mother's home, a home of 40 years. The HOA claimed it was an emergency demolition for safety reasons. I paused, letting my words sink in. Today I'm going to show you what really happened. The first slide clicked onto the screen behind me. Property maps from 1975, showing the neighborhood's original layout. Lisa Chen, my friend on the council, started giving copies to everyone. Karen's smile twitched. "Notice these boundary lines," I said, pointing to the map. The HOA's area ends exactly 3.5 feet before where they started the demolition. Every inch of that demolition was illegal. Whispers spread through the crowd. Karen's husband looked uncomfortable in his seat, but I wasn't finished. "Now let's talk about Golden Parking Company," I said. I clicked to the next slide, showing documents about the company's registration. The company that was going to build a parking lot on my mother's property. Interesting how it's owned by none other than Thomas Whitfield, Karen's husband. Karen's face went from confident to pale in seconds. The other HOA board members started whispering, some already moving away from her. "But wait," I continued, my voice getting stronger. "It gets better." I pulled out a stack of violation notices, hundreds of them, collected from neighbors over the years. Every one of these violations was given to properties that later faced pressure to sell. And guess who bought those properties, using fake companies? I'll give you one guess. The room filled with angry murmurs. I saw Mrs. Rodriguez, who lost her garden last year, nodding strongly. Mr. Peterson, who was forced to sell his old home, was crying. That's when Karen made her big mistake. She stood up, her voice sharp. "This is a witch hunt! You're just angry about your mother's worthless old house!" The room went silent. I smiled for the first time that day. "Thank you, Karen, for that outburst, because now I'd like to play something." I nodded to Lisa, who started the audio recording. Karen's own voice, discussing payments with Golden Parking Company, planning the whole scheme months ago. The next few hours were chaotic. Karen's fellow board members, desperate to save themselves, started confessing everything. The illegal property purchases, the fake violation notices, the payments. It all came pouring out. Thomas Whitfield tried to leave but found city police at the doors. It turns out that fraud that crosses state lines is a federal crime. I saved the best for last. As deputy mayor of this city, I am using Emergency Order 47B, effective immediately, freezing all HOA assets while we investigate. I looked directly at Karen, remembering Margaret's tears. And I'm establishing a fund to help the victims, using those assets. The vote was unanimous. Karen was let out in handcuffs, still yelling about her rights. Her husband was already calling his lawyer. The other board members looked terrified, but the real moment came after, when Margaret walked in with her box of saved photos. The whole room stood up. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "You did good, baby, you did good." As reporters surrounded us, someone asked if I was worried about them fighting back. I looked at the cameras and said what I'd been wanting to say for weeks. In this city, we take care of our own. And if anyone thinks they can bully their way through our neighborhoods again, remember this day. Remember what happens when you mess with the wrong deputy mayor's mama. The headlines the next day read, "Deputy Mayor takes down corrupt HOA empire." But for me, the real victory was simpler. Margaret slept through the night for the first time since losing her home. Karen's time of terror was over, and our real work, rebuilding our community, was just beginning. I almost dropped my coffee when Margaret called me early. "Honey, you need to see this," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. I rushed over to find Karen standing at the edge of our new property line, furious, as the construction crew tore up her precious parking lot project. The look on her face was worth every sleepless night I'd spent building this case. The past year had been a mix of emotions and wins, each one better than the last. After the city council took away the HOA's power, we discovered even more bad things about Karen's operation. It turned out she'd been running similar schemes in 3 other neighborhoods, using her husband's connections to force elderly people out of their homes. The FBI got involved when they traced the money back to some very interesting accounts overseas. I still remember the day we started building Margaret's new house. The whole neighborhood showed up with shovels and smiles, even Mrs. Rodriguez, who never leaves her house. Lisa organized a shared meal, and someone started a fundraising page for all the other families Karen had hurt. The local news loved the story. Corrupt HOA meets its match, and Deputy Mayor's mom became their favorite headlines. The new house took shape slowly, but we made sure to do it right. Margaret wanted to keep the same layout as her old home, but I secretly added some improvements. Wider doorways for her walker, a main bedroom on the first floor, and a top-quality security system. The garden space doubled in size, with a special area for my father's favorite flowers. Every morning, Margaret sits in her new sunroom, drinking tea and watching her roses grow taller than Karen's old ruler could ever measure. Last week, during the housewarming party, little Tommy from next door asked me why there were so many people crying happy tears. I told him, "Sometimes justice takes time, but it's worth fighting for." The community garden, where Karen's parking lot was supposed to be, is now full of vegetables and flowers, managed by residents who actually care about their neighbors. We named it the Thompson Memorial Garden. My father would have loved seeing kids learning how to grow their own food there. Karen's empire fell apart faster than anyone expected. Her husband asked for a divorce when the scandal became public, taking what was left of their money and running off to Florida with his secretary. The last time anyone saw Karen, she was loading up a moving truck at midnight, trying to avoid the reporters camped outside her house. I guess karma does catch up. The best part? Yesterday, I signed the new Homeowner Protection Act into law. Lisa helped me write it, making sure no HOA in our city could ever do this kind of thing again. We included special protections for elderly residents and strict rules for any major property decisions. Margaret sat in the front row at the signing, wearing my father's favorite sweater and smiling proudly. This morning, as I helped Margaret plant new rose bushes along her front walkway, she pulled out an old photo album. Inside was a picture of me at age 8, wearing my father's oversized suit jacket and pretending to give speeches from our front porch. "You always said you wanted to help people," she smiled, wiping away a tear. "Your father would be so proud of how you did it." The neighborhood feels different now. People wave and stop to talk instead of hiding. Mrs. Rodriguez brings Margaret homemade food every Sunday, and the Brown family's kids help in the community garden after school. Even some of the former HOA board members admitted they were wrong, and now volunteer at our monthly neighborhood cleanup. As I sit here in Margaret's new kitchen, watching her bake cookies for the neighborhood kids while singing my father's favorite song, I can't help but think about how close we came to losing everything. But sometimes, the worst moments in life lead to the best changes. The framed newspaper article on Margaret's wall says it all. Local deputy mayor turns personal tragedy into community triumph. Today, I'm going to a national conference for city leaders to share our story and help other cities protect their residents from HOA abuse. Margaret insists on coming along. She says her new mission is to be the voice for those who are too scared to speak up. Looking at her now, arranging cookies on a plate and planning her speech, I see the same strength that got us through this past year. And you know what? Karen might have torn down our old house, but she helped us build something much stronger, a real community. The information in this video is for learning and entertainment purposes and should not be taken seriously. I suggest you do your research and ask dependable experts for the most correct answers. Rules and laws change among homeowner associations from state to state, and even community to community. Always seek counsel from attorneys or experts on situations such as these.